Everyone, and welcome to the University of Louisville's CIEHS seminar series. And today we will hear from the work of Eboni Cochran and Megan Poole. And I'll just introduce them. Eboni Neal Cochran, she, her, his, is the co-director of the Rubbertown Emergency Action quote unquote REACT, a grassroots organization of residents living near or at the fence line of a cluster of chemical facilities commonly referred to as Rubbertown. Her work helps residents fight for strong laws to stop toxic air pollution at the local, state, and federal levels and full disclosure of chemical exposures. Dr. Megan Poole, she, her, his, who got her Ph.D. from Penn State University, is an assistant professor of English at the University of Louisville, where she specializes in rhetoric, feminist science studies, and science and technical writing. Her research considers how rhetoric can bring the sciences to value non-traditional ways of knowing, such as embodied knowledges that come through lived experience. So with that said as introduction, I'll welcome you two to the podium.
Good morning. Thanks for coming. And thanks to everybody for being online. Ebony's making her way up and she's going to kick things off. But before she does, I thought you should know a little bit more about Ebony's accolades through U of L specifically. She doesn't know I'm doing this, by the way. In 2023, Ebony received the Josh Smith Memorial Sustainability Award for her environmental justice work at the local and federal levels. That same year, Rubbertown Emergency Action, which you'll hear about, was given U of L's Outstanding Community Engagement Award. That award comes with a special plaque that's in Ekstrom Library on Belknap campus. So as long as the Ekstrom Library stands, REACT's work will be heralded in our halls. So without further ado, Eboni Neal Cochran.
Thank you. Let's see. Again, I'm Eboni Neal Cochran, daughter of Sterling Orlando Neal Jr. and Emma Jean Neal. I like to highlight them because they were very instrumental in my life, my heroes. First, I'll just tell you just a bit about REACT. REACT is a group of residents who live near or at the fence line of a cluster of chemical facilities commonly referred to as Rubbertown. REACT initially began as a campaign of the Justice Resource Center, which was led by the late Reverend Lewis Coleman. Reverend Lewis Coleman was the, he not only led fights for environmental justice, but also other sorts of fights, labor union fights and things of that nature. And this was just one of the fights that the Justice Resource Center engaged in. And later in that year of 2003, REACT became an independent organization. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what families are up against, families in impacted neighborhoods. So families impacted by environmental injustice are up against the usual suspects, which are chemical facilities, dioxin and soil, legacy pollution from the Gallagher plant, explosions, excess emissions, permitted emissions, chemical leaks from rail cars, odors, whiskey fungus, and much more. Families are also impacted by those that one would think would be unlikely, such as the environmentalists who supported the siting of methane plants in West Louisville, and the city that is not doing enough to fortify our neighborhoods from the threats climate change brings to families living near or at the fence line of the chemical industry. REACT has advocated since 2003 locally Over the years, REACT has fought for environmental justice in many ways, writing letters to the editor, protesting, interrupting meetings we should have been invited to, establishing a bucket brigade, air monitoring team, making comment on proposed permits, reporting odors, speaking before Metro Council, speaking before the Air Pollution Control Board, speaking during public hearings, and filling those rooms to capacity and hosting meetings and forums to help educate residents. We demonstrated and made calls for an effective alert system following the tragic carbide explosion in 2011. During that explosion, 2 employees were killed. And I remember that day very clearly because we did not hear alarms in the neighborhoods. And so one of my co-director, Charles, he ended up driving through neighborhoods and driving through Chickasaw Park, warning people, even though Chickasaw is a little ways away from Carbide, it's still, you know, he went through Chickasaw Park telling people what had happened and advising them, they may want to go home. So there were no alarms that went out. And if you look at this picture right here, this was one of our demonstrations. We want to know, because we want to know when there are excess emissions, when there are explosions, when our families could be threatened. Shortly thereafter, there was an alert system put in called Red Code or Red Alert or something. Now it's called Lens Alert. Because we believe in the meantime work, we've also engaged in direct support of impacted families through disaster backpack giveaways. Over the years, we have also reviewed the various legal notices issued by APCD and provided comment. And there have been many different ways in which REACT has kept the issue of environmental injustice in the forefront. I mean, we've done some fun things too. So this work is super depressing, because when you realize how these chemicals attack your different body systems, you can get kind of stuck in that mode. And so sometimes you have to do some funny things, So we've done street theater where we kind of mocked American Synthetic Rubber Company because they had made a presentation one time about how they were redoing their property and there were not swans, but ducks or geese or something there. And we were just like, really? And one time during Thanksgiving, we did a proclamation for Greater Louisville Inc., which is our local chamber of commerce. They did not support the STAR program. So we did this, overly dramatic proclamation outside. And then we all went upstairs in droves in the elevator. And the little lady at the front desk was so nice and sweet. She was like, oh, she hadn't seen so many guests before. And so the guy comes out and we present him with a paper mache turkey with smokestacks coming out of it. And so he was not happy. So we just laid it at his feet. So we try to, keep it light sometimes too, because this is heavy work. So I'm not sure if you all are familiar with the STAR program, the Strategic Toxic Air Reduction Program. Is a regulatory package locally designed to, reduce our exposure to toxics. One way that Louisville is unique is that we are one of only, I believe, 7 cities in the nation who control our air toxics locally. That's super important for residents in impacted neighborhoods because that gives us access to decision makers. So if they were not regulated locally, we'd have to spend money driving to Frankfurt and trying to deal with people who don't know our communities. And so we want to support local control. And that's something that's always threatened at the state level. So these are some of the things that we did over a 2-year period from 2003 to 2005 in order to advocate for the STAR program. I think it's safe to say that we were the organization that helped to garner community support of this. We were able to get over 3,000 signed postcards, fill the rooms with the meeting rooms. We were participated in over 100 stakeholder meetings. We knocked on hundreds of doors. I mean, we did a lot. We also took air samples. And so we had a bucket system where it had a vacuum. We would put it in a bag. There was this whole process with chain of custody. We would send it off to a lab in California, get those results back. And the funny thing about it is that the city, the people who are supposed to be helping its residents and citizens, tried to downplay our data, even though it came from a legitimate source. But yeah, those are the sort of things that are weird about this work. If you're naive to the fact that the government or the city or the state, they're not necessarily going to be jumping hoops saying, you know, Rubbertown, get your emissions better. Yeah, so we consider them complicit in all of this. Let's see. So after the STAR program was adopted in 2005, REACT was able to expand its work to include more support and calls for legislation at the federal level. We've worked with fence line organizations around the country, advocated for stronger risk evaluations, are in regular meetings with the EPA, have participated in and recruited others to speak during listening sessions, and have testified during hearings. We help to inform new tools being created to aid fence line communities in accessing information about the chemical threats to their communities. We also help to inform the Louisville Charter for Safer Chemicals. And so the Louisville Charter for Safer Chemicals is basically a platform, excuse me, designed with different planks and recommendations so that harm does not come to people, environment, or climate. And I'm just going to read some of the planks of the platform for the Louisville Charter for Safer Chemicals. Number one, to address the significant impacts of chemical production and use on climate change, prevent disproportionate exposures and hazards, and reduce cumulative impacts on environmental justice communities, require safer substitutes and solutions for a non-toxic economy, use scientific data to support health protective policies and practices, take urgent action to stop production and recover chemicals that are unsafe and or accumulate in the environment and people, act with the foresight to protect health and prevent pollution, take immediate action to protect, restore, and strengthen communities, ensure the public and workers fully have the right to know, participate, and decide, incentivize responsible business and safer chemicals, and build an equitable and health-based sustainable economy that transitions us from prioritizing short-term profit at all costs to valuing safety, health, and equity. And so that's what this platform is about. And I encourage you guys to go look. The reason that it is named the Louisville Charter for Safer Chemicals is because people from all around this nation descended upon Louisville in, I think it was either 2003 or 2004. I remember getting a call from Reverend Coleman saying, you need to be at this meeting. The meeting was held actually in Jeffersonville, Indiana, because before this group came in, they knew that Reverend Coleman was fighting all these battles, all these different justice battles, and they asked him, you know, is there a certain place you want us to support or stay? And in honor of Reverend Coleman and in protest of, I think there were some police shootings or something that had happened recently, they did not stay in Louisville, they stayed in Jeffersonville. But when I walked into that room, I saw a room filled with people in a large, huge circle. And what struck me is that not only was I invited into that circle to sit, but I was invited in there to provide feedback. And so one of the things that is very pivotal when you're trying to engage or work with folks who live in the impacted communities is understanding that people living in those communities have a level of expertise that even scientists don't have. And also that people living in these impacted communities can understand a little bit of the science behind it all as well. So yeah, that's what struck me. And that's also in part what has made Air Justice successful, because Dr. Poole, Shivani Carthens did not come to our neighborhoods to save us. Number one, they had a passion for the work. Number two, they asked permission in a way. Number three, they respected the people who live in these communities and wanted their feedback, welcomed it, and incorporated that feedback into the work that we've done together. And so I wanted to end this with a picture of Roosevelt Roberts. He was one of the elders in REACT when I first started. When I first started, all I wanted to do, it was so unbelievable because the first REACT meeting I went to, had to be over 100 people there. People were coming up to the mic, telling their story. Some of them had photographs of their loved ones that they believed were either killed because of the or died because of the chemicals from Rubbertown, or they were chronically ill. They were crying in tears. I was like, what the heck is going on? And so I wanted to do behind the scenes research. But as many of you know, when there are elders in the room, the elders will tell you what you're supposed to be doing. And so me with my introverted self was pushed into the front by, in part, Mr. Roosevelt Roberts. This man literally died fighting for his community. We were in a community meeting. I don't know if anybody in here remembers Dr. Adewale Troutman. He was head of the health department. He was on the stage talking. There were some other. Mr. Roberts was with passion. Da, 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 this is what's happening. This is what you need to do. And then he collapsed. Dr. Troutman jumped off the stage and, tried to save him. They got him to the hospital, but unfortunately, he did not make it. He literally died fighting for people that he believed in and that he valued. And the sign that he's holding here is significant. It says, if your children couldn't breathe, your parents were sick, your neighbors had cancer, your neighborhood smelled of chemicals, you would be angry too. And the reason that these words are so significant is because when you live in an impacted community and you're fighting for any kind of justice, environmental justice, any kind of justice, what is going to happen is there's going to be messaging that is going to create it around who you are. And that messaging is not going to be good. And so one of the things that, I guess the proper politicians and, people in the room, they're so angry, they're so this, have the security there. But if your children were ill, you should be angry. You should be able to express that anger. Not maybe in a violent way, but you should be able to express that. You should be able to raise your voice. You should be able to yell because there is a child who is sick, possibly about to die, and people are just looking at you like, And so one of the things that we learned very early on with REACT is that decision makers, if you tell them your story and that's all you're telling them, they glaze over. They're able to put some sort of emotional wall between what you're saying and what they're feeling. And so that turned us into a more data-driven fence line organization, where we begin to bring in numbers from the TRI. We begin to tell our local officials, using the TRI database and other sources, which chemicals were being emitted from the chemical facilities. And then using the New Jersey Health Department's right to know is a long, a long title. But anyway, they have, a database of chemicals and what systems of the body that they affect. So using that data and coupling that with our stories, we believe made us a lot more effective. It took us from being an organization that was seen as a nuisance to fast forward several years. Now I get calls from decision makers, Metro Council members behind the scenes who might ask me a question or two, whereas before they avoided us like the plague. And so that's one thing that I'm really proud of with regard to REACT, is that we have integrity. There's no need to participate in hyperbole because the facts are bad enough. And so that's it. I appreciate you letting me say that.
Y'all help me thank Eboni. So for the next few minutes, I'm just going to share a little bit about how some of us at University of Louisville and a lot of our students have been working with REACT through this project that we call Air Justice. And what we've been trying to do is work alongside REACT and other residents in West and Southwest Louisville to make environmental science, health, and law more understandable so that it's easier to engage in environmental justice efforts and advocate for healthier air in their communities. I'm an English professor, so we kind of developed as what we called an environmental health literacy coalition, but we'll talk a little bit about like the role of literacy in these efforts and how productive that is or not. So we believe that currently the barrier to entry into environmental health conversations is too high, the learning curve too steep. Conversations about health and pollution should be accessible to all, but they rarely are. So we have our work cut out for us. Our work originated through the storied advocacy of Eboni and REACT. Eboni was the first one who sent me a public notice from our local air pollution control district and said, how do we make sense of this information? So this on the end is Eboni talking to some of my students on an environmental injustice tour in West Louisville. She does that for us about once a term. Last time we rented a big red bus and we looked very U of L. My other co-conspirators in this work, Eboni already mentioned, Shivani Carthens was at U of L Law and is now at University of Kentucky Law. And then we have a wonderful team of students at Brandeis who have been with us for 3 years and are graduating and becoming environmental lawyers themselves. And then we have a super large group of interdisciplinary undergrads, one of whom started with me as an undergrad and is now finishing and graduating this semester with her master's in public health. She's doing her practicum on air quality data, which you'll hear about in just a bit. So air justice began early on in my time at U of L. The first October I arrived here in 2020. And I want to start there with the origins of our work before I launch into the nitty-gritty of the data we've been gathering. Because anytime we're talking about community engaged research and teaching, it's important to share the work before the work, all the community building and the thinking together it takes to build trust, as well as our why we enter neighborhoods and streets as academics, or even more importantly, when we must take off our hats as academics and maybe become scholar activists. At every turn in my research and teaching, I try to get outside of the traditional bounds of the academy. For instance, outside the classroom and into the field, my students go hiking at Bernheim and the Louisville Nature Center. But I also have students try to work with folks like Eboni so that they can understand how science is conceived of and engaged with at the grassroots level. So before coming to U of L, I was doing what I considered light community engaged work. It's the most ethical kind, I find. And it's just partnering undergrads in my writing classes with like local nonprofits and community organizations. Small, manageable writing assignments, things like blog writing, visitor profiles, webpage edits, placards for museums. That work is simple. It can be done in the scope of a semester, and it's mutually beneficial at a basic level. Organizations are vocal about like wanting to engage with the college age students. We as teachers want to engage with college age students, right? But we often like wonder what's on their minds. So these organizations benefit from meeting new students and hearing about their questions and concerns and how they're entering the workplace. Students benefit from learning what writing problems exist in their communities, figuring out how to use their new skills in the courses they're in to tackle local problems. So that's how this work actually began. My undergrad students were doing a semester assignment with One West. How many are familiar with One West? It's this nonprofit that's investing in Black-owned businesses in West Louisville. I was asked to present at their board meeting when a local council person, Keisha Dorsey, was online in that meeting. When she heard I specialized in science and tech writing, she saw me in a non-academic context doing that work. That's pretty crucial. She connected me with Eboni to figure out how engaging with the issue of air pollution could be easier for residents in the Shively area, which is where Keisha was centered. So that was important to us, that I didn't go into the community looking for this work. This project was, and therefore can never be, exclusively mine or exclusively an academic project. I was not planning an environmental health project or a career at that point in time. I was literally writing a book, which comes out next year, on whales and elephants and evolutionary biology. The questions that launched Air Justice came straight from Eboni. And we didn't even start with a clear research question. Our first 2 years was a citywide survey to ask what residents most wanted to know about air pollution. So our first 2 years was a listening project to determine what questions residents wished for us to pursue, what deliverables residents wished us to produce. I don't even know if Eboni knew at the start of this project why I said yes. Sometimes I wonder that too. I said yes, because I was born and raised around chemical refineries along coastal Louisiana. I said yes, because the minute I heard Eboni talk about odors, I realized we had those back home, but I never noticed them because it was home. I said yes, because the minute I started learning more about environmental pollution and started, I was thinking more about like my atmosphere growing up, right? And I was thinking about how there was an elevated lot across from my childhood home that we used to play in. It was really grown up and it was weird. So I'm on coastal Louisiana, right? Like we're below sea level, and there was this like hilly lot. After I met Eboni, I decided to look into what the hell that was, and it was a toxic dump site. I said yes, because the minute I heard her story, I realized why almost everyone in my family has experienced some kind of cancer, why 2 of my 4 uncles have already died of a super rare non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I said yes, because if I hadn't been able to name all that before I met Eboni, then I wasn't alone in being kept out of environmental conversations. So from the very beginning, our project has really been less a traditional literacy project and more a project that scholars are calling epistemic injustice, which is another way of saying we reject the unfortunate trend in literacy studies that assesses what residents don't know about some issues of health, in our case, air pollution. Instead, we study how living the effects of air pollution bring residents to understand the issue in a way that numerical data can never capture. We aim to find ways to value the knowledge that comes from lived experience, not just as anecdote, as stories, but as credible data. All right, that's plenty about our start. If anyone's interested, I have some handouts you can take with you. We organized as a coalition rather than as a collaborative. That was central to how we organized and do work together. I can speak to why we also push against the idea that community engaged work is exclusively inter or transdisciplinary. We think it needs to be more than disciplinary, more than academic, to really value community voices. I can also speak to all the issues we run into with our IRB and our grant administration processes that have kind of handcuffed our ability to run our books and the project as a coalition. The system is really set up to see community partners as community partners, not as researchers on the project. And when we tried to add Eboni as an external researcher, Shivani and I ended up talking to University Legal Counsel in our first year on the job here. That should not have to be the case, right? So our first publication's coming out later this year in the Rhetoric of Health and Medicine, and a journal called Phylon, which is an anti-racist social science journal that honors the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. We talk all about the work before the work. So now, what is the actual work? I don't need to say much about the science of this stuff because you are the experts here and we're relying on your research. But here's a sketch of our understanding. One of the root causes of health disparities in West Louisville is air pollution. The most recent health equity report from Metro revealed that if you live in these areas of West and Southwest Louisville, your life expectancy can be upwards of 10 years less than if you live in East Louisville. And so here at the bottom, you see a map of asthma rates in the city. Where they are worse is in the darker red, of course. I'm pretty sure that asthma map comes from some of the research done by Ted Smith and his team. But that visual could be reproduced with rates of cancer, heart disease, diabetes. Our main map is behind that one. That's our main map for the Air Justice Project. And you kind of see the correlation of why asthma rates and cancer rates are so much higher. This is environmental justice screen data from the EPA. And that sits between markers of the major Title V companies or the major polluters of toxic air in the city. And so you see the most vulnerable communities are the ones that sit on the fence line of toxic facilities. So I'm sure you know that this health equity issue is also a matter of environmental racism. The folks that live in these communities predominantly identify as Black and or predominantly experience poverty. That's why we positioned ourselves as an environmental health literacy coalition. We believe that matters of health equity and environmental racism have a lot to do with literacy, or more pointedly, with how information is distributed to public audiences in a way that keeps public audiences out of these conversations. Because our local air pollution control district and the folks at the EPA do issue public notices. They do hold public hearings for residents to voice their concerns. But when you run the writing, which looks like this, locally, through a reading scanner, you'll find that these things are written at a postgraduate reading level rather than at the middle school reading level that the average American reads and understands science and law. And that's what's so interesting about these health notices. Initially, we were thinking of them as like an environmental health public notice, but they're a legal notice as much as a science notice. And we notice this when we try to work, like this semester, we're working with the EPA to try to figure out how our translation work could be used at the national level. And it's like the scientists say, well, that's all the legal stuff that we don't, we're not going to translate. And then the lawyers say, well, this is all the science stuff that we're not going to translate. And so you just end up with a bunch of gobbledygook, right? So we say environmental health information is not accessible if it's written in everyday language, if it's not written in the language you speak, if it's not distributed in the mediums that you don't regularly engage. So these notices primarily go out through an email newsletter that you have to be signed up to. Last time we pulled the numbers, only about 2,000 to 3,000 people in the entire city were signed up to receive these newsletters. Of those, 300 people opened them. Of those, 30 people clicked to learn more in the city of Louisville. They also go out in the newspaper, but I don't know how many people are reading the newspaper. So basically, we believe that making scientific information and data available is not the same thing as making it accessible. I can't stand that response every time we go looking for data. Well, it's online. The EPA has all this data available for you. Well, that's not super helpful, right? If people are dying in your community. So Q, air justice. We created a community website detailing the science and history of air pollution in Louisville. That was one of the things from the survey we started with that folks said they were most interested in seeing, a community resource website. We turned the local notices you saw into sliders on Instagram so that you can scroll through and digest the information easily. So this is a direct translation of the printout you saw a few slides ago. We regularly attend farmers markets, town halls, school outings, and other community events to talk to folks who aren't already engaged in the issue. In our early efforts to survey residents about what they know and wish to know about air pollution, we conducted our research at those events. We pride ourselves on about 85 to 90% of the nearly 2,000 surveys we collected were taken in person. And so the most interesting qualitative data we got was not just through the survey, but in the conversations around that survey. So, and like I said, this semester, if anybody has tips on, or if you guys want to take it, we have a survey kind of out right now about environmental health public participation processes. So the EPA's TSCA office, Eboni Toxic Substances Control Act office. Okay, I'm learning. They put out similar public notices every time they go to evaluate a toxic chemical. The public notice is really about their process of risk evaluation and trying to convey to the public how they evaluated risk so that the public can more easily weigh in on during the public comment period about the proposed laws on how the EPA should regulate those substances. And so we have a survey out right now where we ask people, I think the one we're working on is perchloroethylene. And so we're asking people to engage with that public notice and kind of dig in. And my science and tech writing students are creating translations of that notice, and we present to the EPA in May. As we've done this work over the last 2 years, we realized, though, that we were calling to residents to engage in a legal system that wasn't protecting them. In all the APCD public hearings we've attended, never once was a permit denied because of community concern. Eboni, have you ever experienced in your 20 years a permit denied that comes to mind? Never denied a permit. And we hear that the air is cleaner. We hope that's true. And there's a great group that's going to evaluate that next year. But asthma and cancer rates are still high. So in 2023, we expanded our work into gathering air quality data with community. Dr. Scott Gunter from Geographic and Environmental Sciences worked with our team to select low quality air sensors that would allow residents to collect their own data. We were also awarded, so on the top you have Airbeam 3.0 sensors. Those are the ones that look like little Pac-Man ghosts. And then the ones below are the purple air sensors, which are much more reliable. Those we were awarded from Dr. Who at the University of Cincinnati. He came and gave a talk here last year. Pat Ryan. So we're working with their team through, they kind of have a group of community orgs, and they awarded us 12 sensors. So these sensors are imperfect. They only measure particulate matter, not chemicals, but we're learning about how residents wish to engage with air quality data. So in late September, we co-located our sensors with the EPA's sensors at Bowman Field to ensure the accuracy of our readings. These are our sensors being calibrated. In mid-October, we installed 12 purple air sensors in backyards, mainly in Park Duval and the Shively area. areas, and you can kind of see our first sensor that was installed on a back porch. They're still gathering second by second data. We also have a group of 15 student and resident volunteers that were using the mobile air beam sensors to walk routes between the stationary sensors in Park Duval to see if we could get block by block data. Park Duval was our pilot area because that was the area where we got most responses from the survey, and then we heard the most odor issues. They like when you pull Smell My City app data, Park Duval reports the most odors year after year. There's also a low smokestack in the area that sits next to an elementary school, and the smoke just kind of when the air is just right will sit on the recess area. And I've been out with an air beam data where it's measuring in the 200 to 300s particulate matter is, and the kids are out for recess. At this point, we've convened a data advisory panel that consists of 4 residents, 2 students, and 2 experts. Dr. Monica Unseld from Until Justice Data Partners and Dr. Juan de Clet Barreo from the Union of Concerned Scientists in DC. They're helping us wade through the data and ascertain what visualizations community would most like to see and whether or not we could try to use this data to push for policy change. We're open to any thoughts you all might have about maybe what holes policymakers might try to find in the data. In the data visualization work, we're assisted by the Center for GIS and the wonderful bioinformatics and biostatistics team here at the CIEHS. Our big discussions are about how to make this air quality information available at a glance. There's a great map that The Guardian put out about particulate matter a few years ago that residents really like. You hover over a census tract area and it shows you the average particulate matter readings in that area and the percentage of people of color who live in that area. And so you can see this direct correlation that defines environmental racism. So we're thinking about whether or not to replicate a map of that for Louisville. Of interest to the team now is that we're seeing major spikes in particulate matter during the 2 to 3 a.m. range that correlates with residents who experience surges in odor at that time. They'll say they're like frequently just awakened in the middle of the night from an odor. We were trying to pull VOC data. If anybody has ideas of how easily we could pull VOC data, we wanted to see if there were maybe spikes in VOCs at that same time that there were spikes in PM. But from what we can find, there's no way to like get current VOC data from like say October or November. From what we can find, like the toxic release inventory VOC data is only updated up until 2022, and APCD tells us the same thing. There's no way to get like present VOC data. So we don't know what to do really with those spikes. They don't seem to correlate with traffic patterns in the city at that point. Like you see spikes during like rush hour and when people are trying to get to work and school. But the 2 and 3 a.m. range is interesting. We're now pulling sensors, data from the purple air sensors that are in East Louisville to see if those spikes are present outside of this Rubbertown corridor. The work is slow and difficult. And because we want everything to be fully vetted by community before we share, I'm not going to show our starter visualizations. I have other artifacts up here, though, one of which is a zine that one of my writing classes created about Rubbertown related stories. There's an expose on Eboni, too, if anyone's interested. It might be interesting for you all to see the issue from undergraduate perspectives, most of whom have never heard of Rubbertown, even though they grew up in Louisville before they entered my class. Some of the stories that they wrote in this zine are really wide-eyed. Some of their interpretations are a bit less complex than we might wish. They really come down hard on the local air pollution control district, and I cringe because we have to work with them. And like Eboni said, we really want to like value the work they do locally. That's important. But I learned a lot about how not to gatekeep and how not to censor through this project and through this work that I've done with students over the last few years, because that work is honest to them. When they encounter this issue for the first time, those are the questions they ask, and that's the way they're responding. Those questions were theirs, the interpretations are theirs, and I think we owe it to ourselves to take the perspectives of people entering this work for the first time seriously. So thank you so much. Eboni, I'll invite you back up because I'm sure they're going to have questions for you more than me. Thanks for having us. There's my email if you have questions. So yeah, questions, feedback. I've got a pen.
Dr. Hine, I have a microphone for you. Testing.
Thanks so much. These are great presentations. With respect to measuring VOCs, we have a Superfund program here that